This video is sponsored by DraftKings Casino, bringing you an awesome deal that you don't want to miss. Right now, new players can play just $5 and get 500 slot spins on a featured game. That's 500 chances to hit it big, just for trying out DraftKings Casino. DraftKings Casino has tons of real money games, slots, blackjack, roulette, and even live dealer games, all right at your fingertips. And with new games added regularly, the action never stops. So don't wait. Download the DraftKings Casino app, sign up with promo code BEINGSCARED, and play today. New players, $5 gets you in. 500 spins. Sign up now with the promo code BEINGSCARED, and the crown is yours. Welcome to Scary Stories Told in the Rain. This video is designed for you to relax or sleep, although it may be hard when you hear some of these allegedly true stories. I'll try to keep the ads to a minimum because I know you don't want to hear them when you're trying to relax. If you like this kind of thing, please subscribe and like the video for me. It helps me out a lot. I really hope you enjoy, and thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. For context, I grew up in a small South Brazilian town. It's a very nice but very cold place up in the mountains. I have had an amazing childhood and still remember most of it fondly, being now a 27-year-old woman. However, something happened to me and my friends one night that will forever haunt me. When I was in high school, the teachers used to organize an annual gymkhana. It's a very common thing over here. A 3 or 4 day event full of competitive tasks, riddles, puzzles, and scavenging, with teams competing for the final award. It used to involve the whole school and pretty much the whole town. So, in one of those events, there was one particular task called something like Look for Your Teacher, where one teacher would hide somewhere in the town, and we, as teams, had to decipher the riddles and go look for them. This was the absolute favorite activity between me and my friends. Looking back, I don't really know how the teachers thought that having a bunch of kids out in the night would be a good idea. But our town was and still is pretty safe, with an incredibly low crime rate. So, when I was about 12 or 13, I was right in the middle of a gymkhana when something terrifying happened. It was a freezing cold night, and my team had solved the Look for Your Teacher riddle. Me and my best friend Junior and a few other kids hopped into some older kids' car and followed the clue until we reached a very dark residential neighborhood surrounded by woods. It was in the suburbs, so the streets were dead quiet, and the only light came from the overhead poles. It was probably around 10 or 11 p.m., and our small squad was very excited to be out in the night this late. We found some other kids from another team, so we figured we were in the right place. Junior and I got our flashlights and anxiously started to look for our science teacher. Since we were best friends since preschool, our feelings and interests are very much in sync. I've always felt safer with him by my side. We were walking and discussing where we thought the teacher would be hidden, maybe behind a tree, or up in one, or perhaps even buried in some leaves. So, we decided to head into the woods. It was very dark, but there were so many kids with flashlights that it didn't feel creepy at first. I was feeling that bubbly, childish enthusiasm kids feel when they are having a lot of fun. We were a few minutes into the search when I suddenly flashed my light to the side and illuminated a man standing by a tree, looking at us. I didn't recognize the man, but I also didn't pay much attention since it could have been a parent or someone from another team. So Junior and I kept walking and laughing when suddenly I feel a tap on my shoulder. I turned around and saw the man again. I remember that he was tall, middle-aged, bald, and had big green or blue eyes. He didn't seem familiar. And now I suddenly felt my stomach tighten a little by the sudden contact with a stranger. The man smiled and asked us if we knew where the teacher was. He spoke to us, but only looked at me, trying to seem amicable. Being a shy and careful kid, I didn't feel good about this at all, so I said no and turned around. Junior and I kept walking fast, both pretty apprehensive. Junior never really liked physical contact very much, but he actually grabbed my hand and helped me go through the dark trees further away from the man. I remember we kind of tried to run from him, getting closer to other kids and adults. We turned around many times, but thankfully didn't see him again. The search went on, and we kind of forgot about this guy. We had a blast, and someone from another team found our science teacher hidden in a tree, literally sitting on a high branch. It was all pretty fun, until we emerged from the woods and started making our way to the cars. It was then that we heard some commotion behind us. We didn't really understand what was being said, but some older kids and teachers were discussing something, and their faces were pretty serious. Junior and I went closer to the adults and understood that a little girl from another team was missing. There were some people still in the woods, but they were supposed to be coming back since the activity was over. This was before everyone had cell phones, so I'm pretty sure most kids didn't have a way of communicating like we do now. Even so, we all heard our teacher speaking loudly that the search was over. After some adults went looking for the girl, we got a little bit more info, and I actually realized that I knew her. She was a tiny, blonde little thing, probably around 7 years old. I don't remember her name, though. Before we could do anything to help, the adults and older kids told us to quickly go back to the team's building. We went back, then home. The gymkhana went on normally, like nothing ever happened. I guess my team made it to second place. I kind of thought it was all very weird about the girl, but didn't really connect the dots until a few days later. Back in school, our class was talking about the missing girl, who was actually found hours later that same night. As it turns out, she was briefly kidnapped by that older man that we saw in the woods. Somehow the guy had lured her away from the group and managed to basically walk her to another neighborhood. As they were making their way to the man's car, some parents and older kids from my school found them and called the police. I discussed this with my frightened parents later, but I don't remember seeing it on the news or anything. Not only that, but me and Junior were not the only kids who saw the man. Pretty much my whole class had seen him or talked to him in those dark woods. I can't help but wonder what would have happened to the little girl if they hadn't found her, or even what would have happened to me if I were a little less careful. Back in 2018, I had just graduated and found a job in another city, and after searching for a long time, I finally moved into a shared house with 4 other roommates. The house was in the city center area, 10 minutes away from my work, but it was very old and creaky. It was impossible to walk from one room to another without waking up the whole house, and I found it really hard to get used to the noises. But what made my life easier is that I got along really well with all of my roommates, as I knew a few of them from high school. We hung out together to play games and watch TV, or just have dinner and talk about random things. A few months later, around Christmas time, all of my roommates were going back home to spend the holidays with their families. But I had to stay for a couple of days, as I was new at work and too shy to ask my coworkers to swap shifts with me so I can spend some time with my family. One day before Christmas, my roommate Emily was the last one to leave that morning. It was a really busy day, Everyone was rushing to do last-minute shopping. It all seemed magical and peaceful and full of life. I finished my shift around 4 in the morning and headed home. As I was walking, I felt a whole different vibe in the air. The streets were empty and calm in an eerie way. I have always finished around this time, but it was never this empty in this area. Suddenly I had this feeling in my stomach. The kind of feeling you have when you know something bad is about to happen, and you regret every decision you made that led to this place and this moment in time. I kept checking behind my back to see if there was anyone around. I pretended to talk on the phone at some point just to try and calm myself down, as if this would stop anything from happening. As I'm holding my phone and still pretending to talk to someone, I hear footsteps. I stopped talking just to hear a bit clearer, hoping that I was just imagining this, but I could still hear the footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I suddenly realized that I haven't said anything in a while, and continued to talk and try to make it sound as if someone is waiting for me. I was only a minute or two away from my house, but I decided to cross the road just so I could check behind me without looking suspicious. So I started crossing and scanning the area around me. I didn't see anyone. I couldn't hear the footsteps either. I started doubting myself. I held my keys tight in my fist. 1, to use them as a weapon if needed, and 2, to open the door as fast as possible, which is exactly what I did. I checked to make sure no one is around, and I crossed the road, running to my house, where I opened the door and locked it behind me. I wish the story ended here, but it doesn't. Before I even had a chance to catch my breath, I walked around the house and turned on the lights. I also turned on the TV, thinking whoever is out there would think there are more people in here and would leave me alone. I grabbed a knife and went upstairs to look from my bedroom window for a better view to the street, trying to see if anyone is around. I kept looking in all directions for an hour, but didn't see anyone or anything unusual. I felt silly for doing all this for nothing, thinking it must have been a lost cat or something. Then I went downstairs to eat before I headed off to sleep. I finished the meal and decided to take out the trash, which is right in front of the door. It would only take a few seconds, and nothing can happen in this very short period of time, right? I grabbed the trash and looked around from the small window next to the door. I couldn't see anything, so I decided to go ahead and open the door. I threw the bag in the bin and went back in, but as I was closing the door, a man sprinted across the street towards me. I don't know how I managed to close the door and lock it, but I did. The man started pounding on the door and shouting, "Let me in! Let me in!" I was terrified. I felt I couldn't move, just standing there looking at the door. Then I pulled myself together and ran to the kitchen to grab the knife again and call 911. After waiting behind the kitchen door, shaking and crying in despair, the police finally arrived and arrested the man. They said he had a pocket knife and a screwdriver hidden in his jacket. Apparently, it was not his first time to break into someone's house and attacking the residents. I try not to think of what could have happened that day if I had moved just a little bit slower. This happened during the summer of 2021. My wife and I were sitting in our living room together. She was playing Minecraft online with our mutual friend, while I was watching something on YouTube. It was a very typical weeknight for us, and we were both well within our comfort zones at the time. It was probably around 9 p.m. when there was a knock at the door. Now, I should probably explain. We had been living in our house for several years by this point, long enough for us to know that someone at the door at that time of night was very unusual, so right away, this put us on edge. We live in a very quiet neighborhood, in a quiet town. Nothing threatening really ever happens here. So my wife peeks out the window to try and see who is there, She tells me that she sees a man at the door, between our screen door and close enough to our main door that she can't see his face. Now right away, I didn't want to answer the door. But a little time passes, and this guy doesn't leave, and knocks again. So against part of my better judgment, I decided to answer the door. But I put the chain lock on first, just in case whoever this was tried to immediately force their way in. To my initial relief, when I opened the door, there wasn't a mad attempt to get inside. Instead, I am met with a disheveled, shirtless man standing in the doorway. The man was probably in his 30s, but he was in such a worn state, it was honestly a little hard to tell. He was maybe half a head taller than me, but much thinner, and I seemed to remember him having a lot of tattoos. I definitely remember his body language and the vibe he gave off, though. There was something very off about him. His eyes kept darting around, hands were restless, and he kept shifting back and forth from one foot to the other. I say to him, "Can I help you?" He responds, "Yeah, can I use your phone?" No eye contact during any of this. I very quickly said, "No, sorry," closed the door and locked it. I was not letting this guy into my house. I looked over towards my wife, but my eyes landed on our cat first. She was standing on the arm of the couch, eyes locked on the door, and all of her fur was standing on end. She was absolutely freaked out. I had never seen her react like that to a person before, and haven't seen it happen again since. My wife is still talking to our friend over the phone, their Minecraft world still up in the background during this. Our friend was freaking out, listening to all this happen. I moved over to look out the window myself, and my wife and I both see this guy, still standing at our door, jamming himself as closely to it as he could, and letting the screen door just press up against his back. It almost felt like he was hiding in our doorway. With him not leaving, and no idea what else we could do, I handed my phone to my wife for her to call the police, keeping our friend on the other phone just in case something happened. And during the time my wife was speaking with the police dispatcher, something did happen. The man eventually turns around, but doesn't leave our doorway. Instead, he looks out towards our front yard, into the darkness. I should mention right now that despite living in a typical neighborhood, our end of the street has no streetlights, so it is always particularly dark around our house at night. In the porch light, we could see the man talking. We couldn't tell what he was saying, but he kept speaking and making gestures towards the darkness, like he was speaking with someone that we couldn't see. Even the thought that there actually could be someone else waiting in the dark was bone-chilling. But I just knew by the way the man was acting that he was speaking to someone that existed only in his head. So he was either on something, or he was in the middle of a psychotic episode, at our front door, refusing to leave. We kept the police dispatcher and our friend both on their respective phones while we watched this unnerving display continue on, trying to stay hidden behind our blinds the whole time. I didn't really want to take my eyes off him, just in case he tried to move to a window or something similar. I don't know how long we waited there watching this man talk to nothing, but he eventually stared off towards the end of our block for a long period. The talking stopped, and then suddenly he ran off towards the street. We watched him disappear into the darkness. And of course, just a minute or two later, that is when the police arrived. We both gave the police our statements, and they said they would have patrol cars search the neighborhood. After the cop we spoke with left, we closed the door and tried to make sense of what happened. I don't remember everything we discussed, but I do remember that we both realized that the police never went into our backyard to check around our addition. We have a small studio apartment-sized guest house in our backyard that we would rarely use ourselves, but it would be the perfect place for someone to hide out if they broke into it. I don't remember which of us put that together, but I do remember that it was me who decided to go check the guest house. I do realize now how dumb this was, and that I should have waited to hear back from the police first. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight and this thick Irish blackthorn wood walking stick I own, called a shillelagh, and I set about my foolish, nerve-wracking task. I checked the outside of the guest house first and didn't see any broken windows or other signs that someone tried to enter. So then, I went inside and checked every closet and anywhere I could think of for someone to hide. My mind and heart were both racing the whole time, but fortunately, the house was empty. I headed back into the main house, which I feel like I should mention is a small house despite us having the detached addition. We aren't rich by any definition. That guest house has a whole separate story of its own. My wife and I both just sort of stayed huddled in our living room for a while. All previous thoughts of YouTube and Minecraft, gone. It was a short time later that the police arrived again. They told us that they actually did catch the guy. He was found trying to enter someone's house through a window. That someone also happened to be an off-duty police officer. They did mention that they have had incidents with the man before, and that this night his symptoms seemed pretty bad. Looking back at it now, I hope that man was able to get some help. He very clearly wasn't having a good night that night, but that didn't change the danger he could have been to himself or someone else. And it doesn't change the fact that the whole experience to this day is the most frightening thing to ever happen to me. I was traveling through Europe from mid-August all the way through January. While I was in Greece, I met this really cute, sweet couple named Maggie and David. They were from the UK and lived along the border of England and Scotland, and they invited me to come and stay with them from October to mid-November. Their youngest child was attending university, and they felt like they wanted another young'un around their cottage house, since they found they didn't enjoy the empty nest as much as they thought they would. So, I agreed that when I was finished exploring Thessaloniki, I would come and stay with them and maybe help around the house and see some of the countryside. I don't know why Maggie called it a cottage house. It was much larger than a cottage. Old, definitely. Very fancy, but old. It was very long and narrow. I suppose she called it a cottage because it was out in the country. I don't know if there was any houses for kilometers in any direction. Maggie was just about the sweetest person I had ever met. Still is, and her and I talk all the time to this day. I don't really talk to David, but that's because David is just not much of a talker. Whereas Maggie was bubbly and warm and loved to tell the stories and jokes. David was more stoic and stern. That isn't to say that he was mean or anything. He was quite friendly, but he just didn't talk very much and certainly didn't joke around, and wasn't much of a storyteller. Most of the time, Maggie would be singing in the garden or talking on the phone with somebody, while David would just sit in his armchair and read a history book. I spent a lot of time helping them out by chopping a lot of firewood for the fireplace, due to the house being drafted and cold quite often. Maggie was really friendly, and she introduced me to all of her son's friends, and today, in turn, introduced me to some really cute girls, and we would leave the countryside and go to the nearest town and get a few pints at the pub. Halloween was soon approaching, and we made plans to have some sort of celebration, maybe by going out to one of the old cemeteries and playing with the Ouija board or something. No plans were yet solidified, but we were in the midst of making something. So, that's basically the backstory. Onward with what leads up to the event. The cottage was a long, narrow, one-story house, and I got to stay in the guest bedroom that was located sort of in the middle of the establishment, and it was placed closest to the kitchen. It was my second or third night there, when I woke up in the middle of the night to hear somebody walking upstairs. Now, as I have already established, this was a one-story house, so I was confused. How could somebody be walking up and down stairs when there were no stairs? The first time I heard this, I figured maybe I was in the middle of a dream, perhaps. Or maybe there was just something outside that was hitting against the walls. Or maybe I was just tripping. I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. The day after, I had completely forgotten about it, as the excitement of being in the UK was overpowering any anticipation I might have felt. I went out with the other folks that Maggie had introduced me to, and went out for more pints at the pub and played darts and other things. I got home late and crawled into bed. It was near midnight now. And there it was again. Unmistakably, it was something walking up and down a set of stairs. I knew I hadn't gone off to sleep at this point because I was still scrolling through my phone for sights to see the next day. Curiosity got the better of me, and I got out of bed and opened the door and peered into the kitchen, and down the hallway one direction, and then to the other. But there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Being a bit spooked and feeling a chill, I approached the fireplace, put a log on it, sat in David's armchair for a moment, and watched the log get eaten by flame when I heard a creaky door close. It wasn't a slam, but it was loud, almost as if the door was heavy. Okay, I said to myself. This is too weird. The morning after at the breakfast table, I casually brought up the stair-stepping. You folks got an invisible staircase or something? I joked. Oh, Maggie's face brightened up with a mischievous smile. You hear the steps, don't you? Yeah, I admitted. Don't you worry about him, love. He's just the butler. I was confused at this point. The butler? I asked. You guys have a butler? No, silly. Maggie laughed. Here, I'll show you. Maggie gets up from the kitchen table, takes a few steps and removes a corner of a rug, and there's this small sort of hole. It turns out there was a handle there, because the next thing I know, Maggie lifts up the floor with this arduous, freaky, creaking sound that revealed a doorway in the middle of the floor. See? She said. We have a wine cellar. Oh, I gasped, surprised. Back in the middle of the 19th century, this house belonged to some high-class people, royalty and all. This is where the butler slept, down here. So, you mean... That's right, mate, David said. Our house is haunted. Oh, don't scare him, Davy. Maggie slapped at David's shoulder, continuing to say, Listen, love, most people never even hear the footsteps. Just ignore it. The butler's harmless. The phone rang, and Maggie answered it and went into the next room. Aye, the butler's harmless, David said. Then whispering, almost to himself it seemed, he continued, It's the other one you gotta worry about. I asked, The other one? Aye. He leaned forward a bit as he spoke. The lady of the house. You're trying to scare me, aren't you? It's almost Halloween and all, and you're poking at a bit of fun with the foreigner, right? I'm afraid not, mate. David was all seriousness. Like I said, he really wasn't a jokester. This was the most I'd ever heard him even speak. Listen, a long time ago, the lady of this house lost her child after a few weeks of the infant being born, and she became stricken with grief, naturally. Not long after, she went completely mental, or so the story goes. The husband tried to get her help. Her family tried to get her help, but nothing was to be done of it. The husband left, many of the servants left, and the only one who stayed was the lady of the house and the loyal butler. Losing a child made her start to become a bit touched, but her husband leaving had made her go completely nutty. The family was concerned, of course, but more so they were embarrassed. It didn't look good for a family of that stature. They wanted to quietly whisk her away and have the lady put into an asylum. The lady of the house found out about this news from the butler herself. Well, after losing her husband and her baby, the last thing she would ever want to lose is her home. She swore that nobody would ever remove her from her house. She swore it. And hearing this information coming not from her closest family, but from her servant. Well, that sent her into a rage and paranoia and a sense of betrayal. Rumor has it she poisoned the butler, and he died down there in the cellar. When her family came to have her taken away in a straitjacket and placed into an asylum, is when they stumbled upon a horrific stench of a decomposing body down below. She denied nothing. Being dragged out of her house by her own family and by policemen, she swore she would never leave the house. Not completely. She vowed one day, that she would return, and when she returned, she'd be at home for good and forever. Or so the story goes. I was in shock. I was mortified. I couldn't finish eating my breakfast. "And the lady?" I asked. "Well, lad," David said, "she's the lady of the house, of course, and she's still here, lingering in the walls, and she's a part of the window panes and the floorboards. She's in the lamplight and in the dark corners. As long as we never forget that, and as long as we are respectful, no worries are needed." I only hear the footsteps, though, I concluded. "Oh, give it time." David was writing from his chair at the kitchen table. "She makes her presence known when she wants you to know." "Is she an angry, scary sort of spirit?" "Well, she doesn't much care for people living in her house, lad. But she's not of this world anymore, so she's not in charge anymore, as much as she would like to be." "Davy!" Maggie entered the room yelling. "What are you telling the boy?" David grimaced at her, saying, "The truth, Margaret. I was telling him the truth." And with that, David sauntered away and sat at his armchair by the fireplace and began to read the newspaper, like nothing bone-tingling was just dumped on my lap. The next few nights were rough. I had trouble sleeping. As soon as the footsteps up and down the stairs started, my hair would stand on the back of my neck, and I became paralyzed, too scared to open my eyes and search the room. I couldn't help but shake the feeling someone was in the room with me, standing in the dark corner, behind the shadows, just glaring at me with disapproval. This could have all been in my mind, I understand. I heard a scary story, and the next thing I knew I was convincing myself I was not imagining things. It happens to everyone, right? For 3 nights in a row, I lay in bed too scared to move until the break of dawn, and if I had to use the bathroom, I just held it. On the 4th night after the story, I lay in bed, shivering. The footsteps began. And then there was a knock at my bedroom door. Maggie? Is that you?" No answer. "David? Hello?" No answer. Then there was a scratch, scratch, scratch on the other side of the door. It had been holding up until that point. But shortly after I relieved myself unknowingly and lay in a wet puddle, still too horrified to move. The morning after was Halloween. I did my laundry because, well, yeah, because of my little accident. After it was all done, I didn't spend much more time in the house. I hung out with some friends that I had made in the village, and we lounged about basically. Before it got dark, everybody had to go home and meet up with their families, and we decided we would all reconvene later that night. I was dropped off at the cottage, and I hesitantly went inside. Maggie and David were by the fireplace watching television. I didn't want to be alone, so I sat on the sofa and watched some sitcom with them. I couldn't understand a word of it, though. The dialect and the slang were all still very foreign to me. It didn't matter, though. It's not like I was able to focus anyway. It was nearing dark, and I found myself constantly peering out the window, hoping to see the headlights of one of my friend's cars approaching. No such luck. Boom. A door slammed. The lights all went out. The television turned off. Pitch black. Silence. "Bloody hell," Maggie said. She's here. The lights flickered back on quickly. The television turned back on to a blue screen. Boom! Another door slammed across the hallway. David yelled, "Get out of here, lady!" I cowered in fear, balling up in the corner of the sofa. Another door across the hall opened so violently its doorknob hit the wall. Then there was total silence. Suddenly, faintly, a crying sound was heard. "Oh, she's at it again," Maggie said. Seeing me absolutely petrified on the sofa, she came and sat down next to me and held me. The crying turned into a woeful sobbing. Louder and louder it grew, traveling about the house, through the hallway, in and out of bedrooms. Boom! Another door slammed. The lights went out. Pitch black. The violent sobbing turned into screaming. A lamp by the TV flickered on, then off, then on, then off. The kitchen light turned on. Boom! Another door slammed. Then it violently was thrust open. Then it slammed again. Then the screaming turned into some sort of shrieking. Maggie was holding me tighter, which only scared me more. I didn't know if she was scared too, or if she was just trying to comfort me. Then I had a disturbing thought. What if this isn't Maggie clutching me in the dark? It was too dark to see. So how could I know? Next thing I knew, all the doors in the house violently opened and were stopped by the walls. A terrible woman's voice wailed, "Get out!" The lights came on, and I ran out the open front door like a little kid who just saw a monster. For all I knew, I did just experience a monster, and it had turned me into every bit as vulnerable as a little girl. I got to the road and stood there, crouched, panting heavily, until one of my friends pulled up. I got in the car and began crying, sobbing, shaking. "What's with you, man?" my friend asked, her hand worriedly resting upon my shoulder. I tried to explain, many times. I don't think she ever knew what to make of it. I don't know if she believed me. Obviously, she knew I was upset. I was a bummer for everyone to be around that night, and we didn't do much Halloween celebrating. I kind of killed the mood. I spent the night at one of my friends' houses, and the next day they came with me to help me go inside and grab my stuff from the guest bedroom, and then they took me to a hotel, where I stayed for my duration in the UK. I still speak with Maggie and David, and Maggie especially feels awful. I know she wasn't trying to deceive me. As she said, people rarely heard the footsteps, and she explained the lady of the house never attacked when there were guests. The incident was such a rare occurrence that even Maggie and David themselves were surprised. I don't know how anybody could ever live in such a house. Every Halloween, I think about this event, and it has stuck with me in some of my nightmares and my daydreams. I certainly believe now that All Hallows Eve is a paper-thin portal for spirits to easily enter our realm and make their intentions known, good or bad. Many spirits I can feel sorry for. Some I don't. But never again do I want to be anywhere near the lady of the house. On a rainy Valentine's Day evening in February of 1971, 19-year-old Jesse McBain drove over to meet his girlfriend, Patricia Mann, at her college dormitory in Durham, North Carolina. They had arranged to celebrate the most romantic day of the year by attending a Valentine's dance at the nearby Watts Hospital. Patricia was studying nursing, and her practical lessons took place at Watts, so as a potential future member of the nursing staff there, she had managed to land an invitation to the dance. At approximately 11:30 p.m., Jesse and Patricia had one last dance, said their goodbyes, then began to walk back to Jesse's car. They then drove over to a deserted housing development area that would later become the neighborhood of Crowsdale. No house had been constructed yet, but a few sections of road had been laid out in an area that was shrouded by a quarter-mile's worth of greenery. Those that ventured down there were likely to find collections of beer bottles and cigarette butts strewn among the trees. It was a place people went to screw around, exactly the kind of private, out-of-the-way place that two young lovebirds might need to get a little alone time. Patricia's 1 a.m. curfew came and went, and her friends back in the girls' dorm assumed she would sneak back in at some point on her tiptoes. Yet little did they know, they would never see her or her boyfriend ever again. The following morning, Patricia still hadn't returned from her date with Jesse. This was the first time the young woman had ever broken her dormitory curfew, and those close to her were quickly beginning to worry. They knew Patricia to be a deeply mature and responsible young woman who always played by the rules and took authority seriously. And to their knowledge, Jesse was an affectionate, respectful boyfriend, one that Patricia seemed very much in love with. But not even youthful romance would be able to make the young nursing student break curfew. Slowly but surely, as the day progressed, the concern of Patricia's roommates went from mild to grave. What started with a few questions turned to them calling around local hospitals in case they had been in a car accident. They then filed a missing persons report with the Durham County Sheriff's Department, but were still so anxious that they began to physically search for their missing roommate on foot. They roamed the surrounding area, canvassing her usual hangout spots around town and on campus, until someone had the idea to go search the Lover's Lane over at the housing development. It was here that the searchers would find Jesse's empty car parked in one of the quieter spots on the development. The car was locked, and on the back seats were 2 warm coats, presumably belonging to Jesse and Patricia. There was no damage to the car. Everything about the scene seemed perfectly in order, except of course for the fact that the last 2 people to travel in it seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. By this point, local police have informed both Jesse and Patricia's parents that their children are missing. At first, all involved had entertained the idea that the couple's disappearance was nothing more than a misguided but romantic attempt to elope, to skip town, get hitched, and settle down somewhere new. But investigating police quickly began to realize that there was something distinctly sinister about the case. There had apparently been no attempt by either Jesse or Patricia to inform anyone of their plans, not even close friends, and the idea that neither would at least leave a note or letter to a relative seemed highly unlikely. Over time, those closest to Patricia began to assume the worst. "I just got the sickest feeling in my stomach," said a cousin of Patricia's. "I just knew something terrible had happened." For 2 weeks after they were declared missing, a team of police officers and local volunteers mounted an intensive search of the surrounding area, combing through the wooded areas around Lover's Lane for any trace of the missing couple. They followed up lead after lead and tip after tip, but no one could find hide nor hair of Jesse or Patricia. With frustration mounting, police decided to widen the range of the search area and enlist the help of helicopter support and specially trained forensic divers. But in the end, it was the misfortune of a surveyor in nearby Orange County that provided the police with their most important lead. On February 25, 1971, a full 12 days after Jesse and Patricia went missing, Robert Kirby is walking along a dirt road in the backwoods of Orange County, North Carolina, when something catches his eye. Among the trees, maybe 50 meters or so off the trail, the surveyor thinks he sees what appears to be the limb of a mannequin laying among the fallen leaves. Curious, he wanders over to check it out, but the distinct shape of a human leg he sees is not that of a plastic mannequin. It is real human flesh. He rushes to a nearby roadside diner to have someone call the police, and by the end of that, forensic investigators discovered not 1, but 2 human corpses up in the woods of Orange County, and they turned out to belong to none other than Jesse McBain and Patricia Mann. Finding the young couple and that they were decomposing was bad enough for the searchers, but the manner in which they had obviously been dispatched was massively disturbing to them. The couple had their hands tied, and they were made to stand back against a tree so another, larger rope could be wrapped around them. Once their killer had secured them in place, he began to torture them. Jesse's ear and mouth were both found to have blood in them, and a variety of large and small abrasions to his lips and forehead suggested he was beaten senseless before he was killed. At some point, Jesse and Patricia's killer had ripped their eyelashes off before continuing to savagely beat them. Then, when whoever had tied them up had grown tired of beating them, they wrapped rope collars around their necks, using a kind of knot that could be repeatedly tightened over and over again. We can only assume that the killer used these rope collars to slowly choke the life out of Jesse and Patricia, gradually tightening the rope collars over a drawn-out period of time until neither was able to breathe. Each of the couple's bodies had all of their valuables intact. Jesse was still wearing an expensive wristwatch and a class ring when his body was found. Patricia was also wearing jewelry, and her purse was left back in the abandoned car. Their deaths were not part of some robbery. Their killer had absolutely no monetary gain in mind when he had taken them. Neither were there any signs of indecent assault on Patricia. She had a great deal of bruising around her face and neck, but nothing below the waistline. There was no ulterior motive. All their killer wanted to do was torture and kill them. The investigation that followed was severely hampered by different agencies' complete lack of collaboration. For example, the FBI seemed to consider the local sheriffs as frankly beneath them, and a feeling of contempt quickly grew between the two groups. Everyone worked on the case as individuals, as Detective Tom Horn once put it. Not a lot of information was being shared by the various agencies, and the rivalry was tremendous. A lot of work was done, but it was individual, so there was definitely some missed opportunities. Yet even with the appalling level of disorganization that pervaded, a number of likely suspects emerged as a result of some tip-top police work. Some had to be ruled out after taking polygraph tests, which proved their innocence. But one of the men who failed was actually a doctor at Watts Hospital who had previously worked with Patricia Mann. When the police sought to question him again, he completely refused to cooperate and would only release a statement through a defense attorney he began to keep on retainer. This made him the #1 suspect in the entire case, and to this day, there's never really been anyone else who had garnered such legitimate scrutiny. But without the proper evidence to charge him, very little action was taken against any of the supposed killers. No one ever really zeroed in on anyone, Detective Horn stated, and as a result, the case quickly went cold. 43 years later, in 2014, Detective Tim Horn was still working for the Orange County Sheriff's Department when a cousin of Patricia's, Carolyn Spivey, contacted him with some fresh information regarding her cousin's murder. Along with his partner at the time, Detective Horn opened up the previously closed case file, poring over old statements and boxes of evidence. They reanalyzed the possibilities of former suspects, considered new ones, and began to condense as much of the multi-agency information as possible into the pursuit of one solid suspect, and they succeeded. Detective Horn then contacted almost every single one of the detectives who worked the case back in 1971 and gathered them together for a presentation. It was one which would show them how he had pieced together multiple pieces of a decades-long puzzle, only to come to one solid conclusion, that it was the Watts doctor, a man Patricia had actually known, that had murdered her and her boyfriend Jesse. When the presentation was finished, what followed was a prolonged silence. To all in attendance, Tim Horn's hard work had presented them the best opportunity yet to end a mystery that had persisted for almost half a century. They had their suspect. They had evidence. Now it was time to make their move. Using what's known as an MVAC, Detective Horn was able to extract a DNA sample from the knotted ropes used to tie up and strangle Jesse and Patricia. An MVAC is basically a wet vacuum DNA collection system that is designed to extract strands of DNA from difficult to reach places just like the fibrous folds in a length of rope. What came back was a DNA sample that didn't match either Jesse or Patricia, so in all likelihood, it belonged to the killer. Detective Horn then requested a DNA sample from their number one suspect, the Watts doctor that Patricia had worked with. Horn's argument was that, after all this time, the doctor would finally be able to clear his name and prove that it wasn't him that executed the young couple. But the doctor refused, having his defense attorney contact law enforcement to release a statement in legalese. And that just might be the most suspicious thing about our doctor, because it really does raise the question of what does he have to hide. Yet despite such obvious suspicion, this doctor has never been charged, and whatever new evidence led to him being asked to provide a DNA sample hasn't been shared with the public. We can only assume that the Durham County Sheriff's Department are in the process of putting a serious case against the man, and are trying to find some way of forcing him to give a sample of his DNA. And with that DNA sample, law enforcement might just be able to end the 40-year-old mystery of who could be cold and cruel enough to wrench a loved-up young couple away from one of the happiest nights of their lives, only to torture and eventually execute them in a secluded, wooded area, turning a romantic Valentine's Day night into the very last that each of them would ever spend on Earth. A few summers ago, I worked at a mall in Toledo, Ohio, a pretty big city nestled right up against the west end of Lake Erie. I was very concerned about money at the time, and I wanted to work as much as possible in order to save up for an apartment, my first major purchase. To do that, I took a job at the Great American Cookies shop in the mall's food court, which had been around since before I was born. And to get some more bang for my buck, I worked there at night. For those who don't know, a lot of bakeries and coffee shops will often hire a baker to come in at dead of night in order to make all the pastries and treats for the morning. They'll come in around 3 a.m. and just bake for hours on end. That was exactly what I did. I pounded out cookie cakes and put cookies in the oven until the sun came up, and then I stayed even longer to make some more money. It was actually really cozy and relaxing, between the heat from the oven, the silence of the mall, and the freedom to blast my music or my podcasts. But it also put me on edge sometimes. It was haunted as heck, and nobody really knows why. One morning I was in the middle of eating breakfast at my counter when I heard the carousel's sharp music echoing through the massive food court. To set the scene, our food court has this little play area on the opposite side from where I work. It's got all these kiddie rides that light up and play music, and they are all motion activated, so they light up when people walk by. Normally I wouldn't give the sound a second thought, but I knew for a fact that there wasn't supposed to be anybody else in the mall at this hour, and there's no way that I could have activated the ride sensor myself. As a person who regularly listened to scary stories while at work, I was immediately excited and anxious to see what might have happened. I turned on the oven and shut off the lights to every area but my workstation in order to tune in to the other end of the dark food court. It was nearly pitch black beyond the dim lights above my workstation, but I could see that the only thing out of place was that carousel, which was now spinning just enough for its creaking and scraping to find a rhythm. It wasn't until a second ride activated that I saw what really set it off. Illuminated by the headlights of one of the race car-themed rides, it was clear to me that there was something standing behind the carousel, something that was now facing my direction. the very defined silhouette of a security guard, leaning around the central pillar of the ride. I had been standing and leaning around the corner of a doorway, essentially mirroring it, trying to keep hidden enough to watch uninterrupted. I did that until I started to feel uncomfortable with what I was looking at. If they are standing on a carousel, why aren't they spinning? If they are a security guard, why aren't they doing their rounds like they do during the day? Why were they trying to sneak around in the first place? I kept my eyes glued on the opposite end of the food court as I texted one of the security guards I knew. They confirmed my suspicions. I was the only person scheduled to be in the mall. I glanced down at my phone to reread the text. It maybe took a second. The moment I felt my gaze drop, I stopped myself, but it was already too late. There was now something standing about 5 feet away from our counter, right along the edge of my field of view. Fun fact about the counter of our shop: it's not tall. I, standing at 6'4", could essentially step over it, and my comically short sister, who worked the day shift, told me that she sometimes just leapt over the counter after closing up shop. I was now essentially standing in an island with only one route of escape if this creep decided to jump the counter. I took the opportunity while I had it and left the shop. It didn't end there, though. My car was parked pretty far away, so I instead decided to run along the long service hall towards our stockroom. It was the only other door in the mall that I could lock and unlock, so I pushed my back against the door and locked the deadbolt behind me. Feeling better behind a locked door, I sat there, watching YouTube under the blindingly bright ceiling lights. I felt secure and safe in that room, right up until I heard footsteps coming slowly down the hallway. They were slow and light, like a kid tiptoeing down their stairs on Christmas. It was almost playful. I held my breath and waited for the footsteps to pass by my door. It was like they stopped just before it and started to walk in place, as if it knew where I was but couldn't get to me. It was then that I heard these clicking and flickering sounds, some mix between the sound of keys jingling and lights popping on and off. Whatever was outside that door, it was just having its fun scaring me. I'm sure a lot of people have had a nightmare where they were running away from a threat that always knew exactly where their prey was. It felt like that, but I knew this was real. Luckily, I also knew I was safe, and at one point or another, I realized that the footsteps were gone. It wasn't until after I told the story to my coworkers later that I realized I never had to reopen the deadbolt to exit that stockroom. It was already unlocked. This is a night I'll always look back on and ask myself, what if I hadn't decided to do what I actually did? It was a night during the autumn season. I bring this up because it's important to know that it was dark out in the early parts of the evening. It's also important to note that the weather was cold enough to the point where we didn't have any windows or doors open in the house. So this night started off with my parents leaving to go to some dinner party, a regular thing with them. They have a lot of friends and get invited to a lot of events. I was often left home alone, and I loved it. I loved the peace, the freedom to do as I pleased, and the freedom to eat what I pleased, when I pleased. The night started like any other night like this. I was enjoying the peace, watching TV, and at around 6 o'clock or so, I decided to make something to eat. I don't remember what I had. All I know is I didn't order anything because I know I didn't deal with any delivery people that night, and certainly wasn't expecting anyone to come to my house. So I'm just finishing up my food, throwing away my trash, and putting whatever silverware in the sink. Afterwards, I just randomly decided to look outside the window of my front door, which was closed and locked. I do that sort of thing often, not for any particular reason. I just get curious. We live in a pretty safe neighborhood. Nothing ever really happens, and it's to the point where you hardly ever hear any sirens going off. Anyway, I just look outside from my front door that has a window on it so that you can see the outside before you open it. I wasn't expecting to see anything, and I wasn't doing this to investigate any kind of noise or anything. But when I look outside, I see a man walking up to my porch carrying something in each hand, in plastic grocery bags at his sides, and a running car in my street. I didn't really hear the car approach, and even if I did, I would just assume it was a neighbor's car running. But I am seeing what looks like a guy who's here to make some kind of delivery, and I didn't order anything, especially not anything you would carry in plastic shopping bags. I also noticed that the running car in the street had a driver in it, while this guy was walking up my path to my porch. What kind of delivery requires two delivery guys? It only took a split second for me to see that this isn't a delivery where they have got the wrong address. My doors and windows were all locked, so I wasn't really worried just yet. Just cautiously curious as to what I'm currently seeing. So the guy walking up my path stops about 3 steps away from my porch and just stands there for a few seconds. It's dark out, and I can't really see his face. I know that it's a man from his height and build, but I can't identify anything distinctive about him. After standing still for a few seconds, he turns around and almost runs to the running car with a driver inside it and gets in the passenger side. I'm guessing he saw me look out my door and realized his cover and plan was blown before he could do anything. After watching him talk to the guy driving for maybe a minute, they take off down the street. It's now that the realization of this whole thing hits me hard. Clearly, they were robbers looking to break in, steal whatever valuables they could find, and get away as fast as possible. Why my house when it's smack dab in the middle of the street with plenty of neighbors as potential witnesses? Why my house when it's nothing fancy and looks no different from any other house around here? And what made them think no one would hear them attempting to break in with what I assume were tools in the bags that the man was carrying? I was honestly unsure what to do at this point. I knew calling my overprotective parents wouldn't help. Not to mention I wouldn't feel safer if they came home or anything. I'm a fairly muscular guy, so I'm pretty confident I could defend myself if the need ever presented itself. I knew calling 911 would be a mistake. After all, they're gone. I don't feel in danger. I can't identify them, and even if I could, they technically didn't do anything illegal. Even though I'm fairly certain they weren't delivery guys, from the facts I mentioned earlier, I doubt a 911 operator would think otherwise. I decided to call my best friend and get his opinion. He believed my story and was rightfully concerned for me and skeptical of what I should do as well. It wasn't until after I told him the story that it occurred to me that we keep a non-emergency police line written on the side of our fridge, and I decided to call that. I thanked my friend and told him that I would update him later. We had this non-emergency police phone number written down after looking it up because there was a time where we needed the police, but not for an emergency. Even though this was a safe neighborhood and nothing ever really happened, there was a day where these two crazy guys were going door to door asking for money. One of them wasn't wearing shoes, and the other guy said he needed money to buy his friend's shoes. My dad, who answered the door during this moment, slammed the door in their faces and watched them go to the other houses on our street. He looked up a non-emergency local police number and called it to report them. They arrived on our street without sirens and found the two men going to houses asking for money and arrested them. So we kept this number on our fridge just in case we ever needed it again. and I needed it now. I spoke with a nice woman and told her what had just happened. She asked me a few questions like, what were they wearing? What kind of car were they driving? Etc. I explained that this all happened pretty quick and I wasn't paying much attention to those sort of things. Stupid, I know, but I was a little stunned in the moment from just happening to see a stranger come up to my door, carrying bags. I told her that I didn't think I'm in any danger, yet, and if anything else happened, I would call 911. But because I was worried that they may be trying to break into another nearby house, I asked her if there were any police patrolling the area, if they could just inspect my nearby streets, just in case. She gladly agreed and thanked me for calling this number and not 911, as she agreed that this wasn't an emergency. I just went back to sitting in front of the TV for the rest of the night. I couldn't focus on any show or movie after that. Too many racing thoughts and too many questions as well, as the fear of whether or not they will come back. My parents eventually came home and I told them the whole story. They were shocked and worried now too, but commended me for how I handled this. My dad agreed with my theory that the two men were watching houses, looking for ones they presumed were empty, and decided on ours since there was no car in the driveway and no one had exited it in several hours. But when the man walking up to our door saw my face looking out the door window, he panicked and decided to bail. I'd be lying if I told you there was tapping on our windows that night after we went to sleep. Nope, that was it. No further suspicious activities. No follow-up call from the police. Nothing. Nothing like this ever happened again, and it never made me feel uncomfortable to be alone ever again. But I often wonder, what would have happened if I didn't decide to look out my door when I did? Would I have had to fight off robbers? Did they have weapons just in case? I guess I'll never know. When I was about 10 or 11, I lived in a duplex house with my parents in Tennessee. It was a pretty good size. 3 bedrooms, huge backyard, and a good-sized porch in front of my house. I was in a decent school and had many friends on that block. Plenty of good times were had, and pleasant memories made. However, there is one memory that isn't pleasant at all, and it happened in that house. I always had a strange feeling in that house. That feeling you get when you think someone is watching you, but you are by yourself. That sort of feeling. I always felt like someone or something was watching me from inside my closet, in particular. But being a very self-aware person my whole life, I figured that was just normal kid fears. Something in the closet, something under the bed, etc. But what I couldn't explain was our lights would turn on and off by themselves a lot, and the TV would turn on and off a lot. My father tried explaining it, that it was the electricity or the house wiring, and it didn't seem to bother my parents. One day after school, I got home and started the regular routine. I got a snack, turned on Nickelodeon, and started doing homework in front of the TV on the floor. About 10 or so minutes into it, I heard something coming from my parents' bedroom, like a rustling. I knew my parents weren't home from work yet. It was still pretty early in the afternoon, and their cars weren't in the driveway. For all I knew, it could have been an intruder, and I was a skinny little boy at the time. Instead of getting a neighbor, I started walking toward the bedroom. I then noticed the rustling noise was coming from their bedroom. They had the master bedroom, of course, and I found that odd. What was happening in the bathroom? Like, if it was a robber, why would they be in the bathroom? I get to the bedroom door, which was open, but before I step in, I said, "Mom, Dad, is that you?" I knew it couldn't be them, but that's just what came out. Then it happened. I heard what sounded like a cackle, like a rotten snicker, and then what I can only describe as an old hag's voice. It repeated back my words, only in a mocking fashion. "Mom, Dad, is that you?" Then it cackled again. At this point, I think I'm dreaming and tears start to well up in my eyes. I figured I was about to get jump scared or shocked, so I walked toward the bathroom, thinking I would wake up at the jolt. I got to the bathroom and I saw nothing. Nothing but a bunch of bathroom items knocked on the floor and into the sink. I turned and started to run out, and I tripped on the doorway and fell on my chest. Now I really think I'm dreaming and I start crying, calling for my mom. That kind of thing. It felt like I was on the floor for an hour, but it was probably not even 1 minute. I got up, looked behind me once more, still see nothing, and ran to the living room to get my homework and went outside on the porch, not going back inside until whatever parent got home first. When I told them, they chalked it up to being a dream, that I probably dozed off watching TV and just had a vivid dream. All right, but the thing is, I don't remember waking up that day. The day just went on, into the evening, and then into the night where I probably didn't get much sleep then. Nothing to that magnitude happened to me in that house after, and we ended up moving a year or so later. I'm older now, but still to this day, I am uneasy being in bathrooms, because if I ever heard that voice again, I don't know what I would do. I would probably have a heart attack. The voice was that nasty. I hated that house. One 4th of July weekend in 2011, a buddy of mine that I'll refer to as Todd ended up in a pretty precarious situation. What follows is the story that he told me. It was supposed to be a fun weekend up the hill and in the woods at Todd's friend Troy's cabin. Troy was to introduce Todd to a girl he also invited over. So naturally, Todd was looking forward to some devious fun for the holiday weekend. As luck had it, Todd and his new date clicked and soon found themselves downstairs for some alone time. Shortly after Todd and his date disappeared downstairs, Troy decided to go out for a little while. A little while later, as Todd and his date were getting into it, Troy returned to his cabin with some company. Upon hearing foreign voices upstairs, Todd went upstairs to see who was there. To Todd's dismay, he found that Troy had brought home someone that he disliked, a guy named Ace for the sake of this story. Seeing Ace, Todd got angry and an argument ensued between Todd and Troy, while poor Ace stood awkwardly near the doorway. Cue Troy's girlfriend, entering only to stand next to Ace with a bewildered expression on her face. Todd had rushed upstairs in his boxers at first, thinking that it was just guys that had arrived initially. So he and Troy quickly went downstairs to argue further. As Todd and Troy's argument diminished, Troy decided that he, his girlfriend, and Ace would go night swimming at a nearby creek for a while to cool off. For whatever reason, Troy threw on Todd's shorts to swim in which had Todd's keys, wallet, and smokes in the pockets. Troy and his company had already been gone for a few minutes before Todd realized what had happened. So Todd and his date continued on downstairs until Troy, Ace, and Troy's girlfriend returned to the cabin. Right as Todd heard them returning, though, he went upstairs to confront Troy. Fuming, Todd demanded his shorts back while yelling about his stuff in the pockets during Troy's swim. As the two argued back and forth for a while, Troy's girlfriend, Todd's date, and Ace tried to pretty much blend with the wallpaper. As Todd demanded that Troy take his shorts off then and there, Troy informed him that he would not be stripping down in front of everyone. That was when Ace cut in to have Troy's back, making the argument even worse. But Ace knew that Todd had quite a reputation for fighting and not losing, so in order to sort of prove himself to Troy, he jumped right into that argument. After a little more arguing, Troy and his girlfriend left again in Todd's shorts. Ace stayed behind though, for some reason. Maybe because Troy had left without his backpack full of his personal and important items. Eventually, Todd and his date went back downstairs to go back at it. Ace, of course, stayed upstairs and kept company with Todd's pit bull. They all expected Troy and his girlfriend to return that night, at least for his backpack. But when everyone woke up the next morning, they realized that Troy and his girlfriend had not returned to the cabin. Everyone was puzzled as to what Troy was up to, but since Troy had left his cell phone in his backpack, they all just hung around the cabin and waited for Troy. The second night came and went with no word from Troy or his girlfriend. It wasn't until they got up on the third day with still no Troy that they finally really started to worry. Alarm bells were definitely going off for the trio. Todd decided to try and call Troy's girlfriend again, like he had the previous day when her phone seemed to be switched off. That day it finally rang, and she picked up. Fear crept into her voice when she realized that Troy wasn't back at the cabin like she assumed he would have been. So her and Todd agreed to start calling around to see if they could track down Troy. But no one had heard from Troy at all. Next, a panicking Todd called a few friends up to the isolated cabin to help search the nearby woods for Troy. Not a single trace of Troy was found. It was Todd who made the decision to call Troy's girlfriend and have her report Troy missing. She did just that, but when asked of Troy's last known whereabouts, she gave them the honest answer. She told them that Troy was last seen at his cabin having a heated argument with Todd. The problem with that was that Todd had a pretty well-known reputation for fighting. At this point in which the following events took place, Troy had been missing for 3 days, so he was declared lost at that point. Apparently, the cops decided they should take it seriously. The following morning, Todd, his date, and Ace were fast asleep, only to be startled awake to the sounds of both the front door being kicked in and people running around, seemingly on the roof. The SWAT team flooded in, subduing the trio inside. At one point, one of the SWAT officers said, "I will kill you and I will kill the dog." Upon hearing that, Ace suddenly popped his face up from the floor and exclaimed, "Why would you do that?" Of course, the dog did not get hurt at all. What came next was the trio getting questioned by a couple of detectives portraying in the usual good cop, bad cop scenario. Unfortunately for Todd, though, he was the last person seen with Troy, and they were arguing. Couple that with Todd's reputation for fighting, and well, that made Todd the number one and only suspect in Troy's disappearance. It also didn't help that the detectives had found some clothing left by the hot tub, and some of the clothing had drops of blood on it, though Todd insisted that he didn't even know whose clothes they were. Search and rescue came in next to comb the surrounding woods for clues to Troy's whereabouts. They searched for hours while Todd, Ace, and Todd's date were still being questioned, but they focused mainly on Todd. After a couple of hours of interrogation, Todd finally got irritated and insisted that since Troy had been missing for 3 days at that point, he could either be dead or alive, but they should be focusing their efforts on finding Troy. Oblivious to Todd and company was the fact that search and rescue had located Troy, deep in the woods and hours away from his cabin. Troy was found passed out on a large rock, naked and just hours away from his demise. The next thing that Todd, his date, Ace, and the detectives heard was the sound of the search and rescue helicopter's chopper blades cutting through the air and getting closer to the cabin. As they peered out the door, they saw the approaching chopper with Troy suspended in a blue diaper-like thing from it. The chopper was looking for a safe place to lower Troy enough for emergency ground personnel to be able to reach him. As the smoke was still clearing on the whole situation a couple of days later, Todd was informed about the facts that led up to Troy's disappearance. Apparently, Troy and his girlfriend left the cabin on the night he vanished to simply cool off after the argument with a nice walk in the woods that surrounded the cabin. But right after they had left for the walk, Troy's girlfriend had stolen his debit card. Shortly after setting out on their walk, Troy and his girlfriend got into an argument themselves. They got separated after that, and Troy's girlfriend ended up walking herself back to the main road, where she had called a ride, leaving Troy in the woods and assuming that he would find his way back to the cabin. So basically, Troy's girlfriend turned her phone off for the next couple of days in order to avoid Troy's angry phone calls about his debit card while she partied the whole time. When she did finally turn her phone back on, she received Todd's concerned call about Troy. She was shocked to learn that Troy had been missing for the last couple of days. Troy ended up being relatively okay, considering the circumstances. Todd ended up moving out of state shortly after, which pretty much dissolved the friendship. As far as Ace, Todd's date and Troy's girlfriend, well, they're in the wind, I guess you could say. I'm almost positive, though, that none of the people involved in this story will ever be able to forget about the events that took place over those fateful 3 days at the cabin. I have started taking a supplement known as lion's mane over the past few months. It's supposed to help with brain function and improve memory. I'm pleasantly surprised by how well it's been working for me, because lately I've been remembering a lot of events from my early childhood when I was around 4 to 6 years old, with a surprising amount of detail. A lot of them are good memories, but one in particular stands out to me. When I was younger, my parents would always take the whole family out to a small town in Colorado to go on vacation. We loved the atmosphere of small towns and wide open mountain ranges, and this place was our regular travel spot. Now, when I say small, I mean that this town is home to about 300 people. It got its start as a mining town in the late 1800s, and the families of those miners generally stuck around, and their descendants still inhabit the town to this day. Everybody knows everybody in this town, and people knew my family because we were regular visitors and we owned a few acres of land on the edge of the town. I can recall one vacation in particular. It was around the start of winter, so my parents had taken my brother and I there on one of our school breaks. My grandparents came to join us, and I remember having a great time going on walks with the whole family and playing with the new toys my grandparents had gotten me. One of the toys they got me was a little remote control ATV with a toy man sitting on top of it, wearing a helmet and a biker jacket. I think that toy is the reason this memory stands out to me, for reasons that you will soon understand. On that vacation, we took a walk around the less populated parts of town. Because this was a town that seemed to come up out of nowhere in the middle of the mountains, there were plenty of walking trails and scenic routes to explore, and I would always take walks with my family when we visited. One of our favorite routes included a bridge that overlooked a steep valley, and the scenery looking off that bridge was absolutely beautiful. When we got to that point in the walk where we approached the bridge, there was a man sitting there, with his back rested against the guardrails of the bridge. Now, remember that toy I mentioned earlier? This man was also wearing a helmet and a biker jacket, just like my toy. I remember thinking this was really cool, and I said something to him like, "You look just like my toy." Immediately, my mom said something to the effect of, "Oh, honey, don't bother that man. He's tired and needs to rest." I didn't think much of that because I was a very over-talkative kid, and I was used to my parents telling me not to bother strangers. My dad chimed in, saying something about how he knows this guy and how he was going to stop and talk to him for a bit. He told us that we should all go on ahead with the walk and that he would catch up to us later after he was done talking to the guy. I didn't think much of this either, because like I said, everybody knows everybody in this small town. My mom grabbed both me and my brother by the hand and practically dragged us past the man and onto the rest of the walk. This is the point where I thought something felt weird, because it seemed like my mom was in a hurry for no reason. I asked her who that man was, and my mom just told me that it was a friend of my dad's, and that he'll be back later. I put the whole thing out of my mind quickly and enjoyed the rest of our walk. Only when my dad met back up with us at the cabin we were staying in, did I think about it again, and I asked my dad who the man was. He told me something about how it was just an old friend who lived here, and we never talked about it again after that. Here we are now, nearly 2 decades later, and this memory pops into my mind today when I see a kid in my apartment complex playing with a similar toy to the one that my grandparents had gotten me. I remembered those nice vacations and how much I enjoyed looking off into the vast space of the mountains and valleys. I remembered playing with that toy ATV in the backyard of that vacation cabin, showing my grandparents all of the cool tricks I could do with it. And I remembered that man sitting on the bridge, and how my mom was in such a hurry to get on with the walk, while my dad stayed behind to talk to the guy. Suddenly, that memory didn't quite feel right. Something was off. I kept thinking about it through the rest of this morning, wondering why my mom was so insistent that we move on. Wondering how my dad could have possibly recognized the man when his head and face were completely covered by a helmet. I texted my dad, asking him, "Do you remember that time we were on vacation in Colorado and you ran into one of your friends sitting on a bridge that we were walking on?" It suddenly popped into my head, and I remember it being kind of a weird situation. What happened there? At this point, I was pretty sure I already knew the answer to that question. I just got off the phone with my dad about an hour ago. He called me after seeing my text. He said he didn't think that I would even remember that happening, but that he thinks about it all the time, and that he often worried about whether my brother and I understood what was going on in that moment. He explained the entire thing to me, and my suspicions were confirmed. While we were taking one of our usual walks, we came up to a bridge, and my parents saw that man sitting there leaning against the bridge. Or, to put it more accurately, that man's body. My parents were alarmed when I immediately tried to talk to the body about my new toy, so my dad quickly came up with the idea to say that he knows the guy and that he would meet us later because he wanted to talk to the man. In reality, he had never met the man before in his life. He just wanted to check to see if the man still had a pulse and call 911 about the situation. This next part is what made my dad feel extremely uncomfortable and still makes him feel queasy thinking about it today. He didn't want my brother and I to understand what was actually going on. So in order to conceal the fact that this man was probably no longer alive, he sat down next to the body and started talking to it. He had to sit right next to this man's body and carry on a one-sided conversation with it until we were out of earshot. At that point, he checked the man's pulse and confirmed what he already knew. That resting biker would be resting forever. This was before cell phones were very common, and even then, there would have been no way to get a signal in an isolated town like this. He ran back to town, called the county sheriff from a landline, and ran back to the bridge to wait for them to arrive. While my dad was waiting there, he looked around to try to figure out what happened, and it wasn't hard to tell. The bridge had started to get icy because it was the start of winter, and this man must have been taking the curb onto the bridge a little too quickly. My dad looked over the edge of the bridge, and sure enough, there was a motorcycle at the bottom of the valley. The man had crashed, probably been injured very badly, and had propped himself up hoping that help would arrive. My family did come across him, but not soon enough. Looking back on it, we never took that walking path again in all the times we vacationed there in the future. I think my dad wanted to avoid it, both because the memory of having to talk to a body and pretend it was alive made him feel sick, and because he didn't want my brother and I remembering the situation and figuring out what actually happened. Before my brother had moved out of state, we would frequently go hiking together. One of our favorite spots was out by a river that was about 15 minutes from our house. By the time this took place, he had already moved, and I had not gone hiking. I don't normally hike by myself, but it had been a nice day, and I wanted to get some fresh air. For reference, I am a female, and I was around 19 at the time. The drive to the river was beautiful. I lived in the suburbs of my city, so it was not long before I passed the last of the houses and some businesses that were completely surrounded by vegetation that got thicker the closer that you got to the river. Once I got to the parking lot, I parked my car, got my backpack, locked my car doors, and started walking towards the river, which was just a short walk from the parking lot. The parking lot was fairly large for being a recreational area and could fit at least 50 vehicles, but there were only a few cars there that day. I passed the restroom building and some trash cans on my right and could see some campers by the river, a bit out towards my left. They had been at least 30 yards away from me. There is a walking trail that runs alongside the river that we would normally use that I was heading towards. Once I got closer to the river, I decided to turn right to start my hike instead of going left because I did not want to disrupt the campers. Soon after I started walking alongside the river, I heard a voice call out to me behind me, and I turned around to see who it was. It looked to be an older man, about late 40s to early 50s. He was walking up to me from the campsite and asked if I had a smoke. I had never really been a smoker, so I told him that I was sorry, and I did not. I glanced behind him and noticed that it looked like they had been more than just some campers. It looked like they had been living there. He said no worries. I gave a polite smile, turned back around, and continued on my hike. After going about 30 to 45 minutes, it had set in that I was hiking alone, and I suddenly no longer felt safe. I stopped to drink some water and also got my pocket knife out to hold in my hand in case I came across an animal or something. It had been getting a little warm, so I had taken my jacket off as well and held that over my arm, which had concealed the pocket knife. I backtracked almost to where I had started and noticed that the older man had started to walk towards me again and called out to me. I stopped to talk to him to see what he needed. To my surprise, he had asked me if I wanted to go hang out with them. I told him I couldn't and I had to get back home. I started to walk away and he had asked for my number and grabbed my tank top. I told him that I was sorry and I was not interested and pulled away. He kept holding on to me, my tank top bunched up in his hand for a few more seconds. It felt like minutes, and it seemed like he had been considering something before letting me go. I was terrified, but had been glad that I had my pocket knife in my hand, in case he tried anything drastic. I speed walked back to my car, running once I was close enough. I had gotten in my car, immediately locked my doors, and got out of there as fast as I could. I don't know what would have happened if I stayed with them, or what that man's intentions were, but I have never hiked alone since. On the morning of March 20th, 2021, I saw a post online stating that the Boeing X-37B orbital test vehicle would be visible in the night sky over the northern United States and southern Canada. I have never really been that interested in space, to be honest, but I do enjoy stargazing from time to time, and it was a clear night, so I decided to head out into the hills to try and catch a glimpse of the craft. I tried to convince my boyfriend to come with me, but he was too busy playing Fortnite, or whatever shooter game was popular at the time. I threw an old lawn chair into the back of my new Toyota Tacoma and drove 15 minutes outside of town to where I knew there was a lookout. It was at the end of a long dead-end dirt road that went up the backside of a ski hill and came out into a large open area that overlooked part of the resort, but more importantly, gave an incredible view of the stars. I was hoping that no one else would be up there, since it was the closest thing we had to a lover's lane, where teenagers would go to fool around in their parents' cars. Fortunately, I got lucky that night, as the little parking area was completely deserted. I set up my lawn chair on the grass a few feet away from my truck and gazed up at the beautiful night sky. Even with the almost full moon lighting up the night, there was an incredible amount of stars visible. It was almost overwhelming, especially considering I really had no idea what I was even looking for. I was assuming that I wouldn't actually be able to see the craft itself, and that it would just be some moving lights in the sky, but I didn't know for sure. Every plane passing overhead gave me a little rush until I realized what it was. Finally, 8:45 p.m. rolled around, exactly when the post online said it would appear, and there it was, coming over the horizon from the west. This glowing orb of light moving quickly across the night sky. It had a faint ring around it, kind of like the full moon often gets on a clear night, and I knew right away it had to be the craft. I tried to snap a few pictures, but of course, phone cameras can never capture the true beauty of the night. After about 5 minutes, it had disappeared off to the east, and I was getting cold, so I decided to head home and packed up my chair and got back into my truck. A funny thing about the new Toyota Tacomas is that they come with a GoPro mount on the windshield, just to the right of the rear view mirror. I guess Toyota finally noticed that these trucks are almost exclusively purchased by outdoor adventure seekers. I am no exception to that, and sometimes liked to record footage of my drives on scenic back roads on my way to and from a mountain biking trail to add to the video. Oftentimes, though, this meant that I would get home and leave the camera on my windshield. Well, this time apparently was no exception, because as I got back in the truck, I noticed the camera sitting there next to my mirror and laughed to myself that I had done it again. Then I noticed something strange. The camera was on, and the little red recording light was blinking. Normally, if I left my GoPro in the truck, or even unattended somewhere in the house, the battery would just die, and I definitely didn't turn the camera on, so this was really weird. I was curious, though, as to whether or not the camera picked up anything, since it was a rather bright night out, and my truck was pointed in roughly the right direction, that it might have picked up the craft coming over the horizon. I pulled up the GoPro app on my phone to have a look at the footage, and was expecting to see some of the drive there, but the video started with the truck already parked at the lookout. I wasn't in the shot, sitting in my lawn chair, so it was pretty much just a shot of the sky. I saw briefly what I believed to be the craft in the corner of the video, but it was hard to tell on such a small screen with terrible video quality due to the low light conditions. I was about to turn the video off when I noticed movement off to the right. A large dark shape that I couldn't quite make out was moving towards the truck. As it got closer, I could see it more clearly as it was above the horizon on the video, so it was silhouetted against the bright night sky. It was a huge animal. Based on its height, it had to have been at least 8 feet tall on its hind legs. I couldn't tell if it was horns or ears protruding from its head, but it definitely had something on top. It turned its head, and I caught a flash of red in its eyes as it did, and then it disappeared from the video. That was all I could take. I started the truck and peeled out down the dirt road, sending gravel everywhere as I went. I had been sitting out there mere feet away from this creature without even knowing it was there. I kept expecting it to leap out of the trees any second and flip my truck with its massive arms or something, but it didn't. Every little shadow my headlights cast on the trees made me jump, thinking it was the animal. I just couldn't get that image of its silhouette out of my mind. I made it to the main road and flew back towards town, doing well above the speed limit, and when I got back to the house, my heart felt like it was going to explode. My boyfriend was obviously quite concerned when he saw me walk into the house in tears and asked me what was wrong. I could barely string a sentence together and told him to have a look at the video. I handed him my GoPro and my phone, and he tried to get it to work, but couldn't. He pulled the SD card out and put it into his laptop, and while he was doing that, I calmed down enough to somewhat describe what had happened. To my dismay, when he tried to pull up the video, the footage was all corrupted. Some skiing footage from the winter still left on that card was fine, but the one clip I needed to prove my story was gone. My boyfriend said it was probably just a bear, since they have been known to walk on their hind legs, and showed me several videos of bears doing just that. Even that's not exactly a comforting thought, but unfortunately, I don't think it was a bear anyway. All the videos he showed me of bears walking on two legs looked almost comical, since they really do look more like a human in a bear suit than a real bear. The way they move is rather clumsy, in stark contrast to the very smooth and methodical movements of the beast that I had seen. The silhouette also didn't look the same, but without the video footage to directly compare, and only my panicked memory to go on, who knows what it truly was. All I know is, I definitely will not be venturing out into the woods alone at night, ever again. I firmly believe that no technical error with my GoPro could have possibly turned it on at that exact right moment to capture the beast, and that whatever the beast was, it must have had something to do with the camera turning on, and I also believe it had something to do with the corrupt footage. It didn't want me to be able to prove its existence, but it definitely wanted me to see it, and to know that it was watching me, possibly as a warning not to trespass on its territory again. The following events happened to my father in the late 60s when he was about 7 or 8 years old. I have changed the names for privacy. Growing up in a rural Canadian town to a poor family, my father Dean and his siblings never had much in the way of entertainment. Often left unsupervised, were all too frequently left to their own devices, giving them ample opportunity to indulge in interesting and sometimes dangerous activities. After accumulating several injuries this way, rather than putting their foot down, Dean's parents chose a more hands-off approach. The children's misadventures became all too easy to ignore completely. On a warm summer evening, the sun still burning high in the sky, Dean found himself wandering the neighborhood with 3 of his good friends who lived nearby. Spending most of the day roughhousing and pulling pranks, the group of kids decided their fun just wasn't over yet and brainstormed on where to play next. One of Dean's friends, Thomas, suggested they go play in the local quarry, as there were plenty of boulders and sand dunes to climb on. Being a year or so older than the other boys, Thomas's ideas always seemed like good ones, and so they all headed out to the big pit. Upon arriving at the quarry, dunes upon dunes of sand loomed over them, and the group of kids headed straight for the tallest one. They all took turns climbing up and sliding down through the sand. They were having what seemed like innocent fun, and had no idea their fun was about to quickly come to a terrifying end. Atop the dune, Thomas readied himself to slide down to his friends waiting below. Dean and the other 2 boys, Will and Jason, sat on the lower part of the dune cheering on Thomas. But as he began to slide, their cheers turned into screams of horror. With Thomas came an avalanche of heavy sand, engulfing the 3 boys entirely. Unable to stop, Thomas rode the wave of sand to the bottom of the dune and quickly realized that his friends were all buried alive in its wake. Frantically, Thomas started digging through the sand. A minute passed before he could hear a faint voice from beneath the dirt. He clawed and clawed until he eventually uncovered Dean, out of breath and pale as a ghost. Having been sat higher up on the dune than his 2 friends, Dean had been fairly close to the surface after the avalanche. The 2 continued to dig randomly, not knowing where or how deep Will and Jason were in the pile of sand. Realizing the severity of the situation, they knew they needed help. They separated, each running home as fast as they could. Dean burst through the door of his house, yelling to his parents that his friends were buried in the quarry and that he desperately needed help digging them out. Covered head to toe in sand and obviously distressed, his parents took one look at him and shook their heads. Rather than help and concern, he got a lecture. They didn't believe his story at all. He continued to beg them for help, but to no avail. Eventually, getting impatient, Dean fled the house to head back to the quarry, hoping that Thomas's parents hadn't been so ignorant. He arrived shortly to find Thomas, his parents, and several neighbors digging furiously through the sand. After several minutes, the boys' bodies were found amongst the sand, completely limp. It was too late. Ambulances came, and officers got details from Dean and Thomas. The two surviving boys never spoke again after the accident. Dean was never given any of the support or resources he needed to deal with the traumatic events that day. He lost his best friends in an instant and has never truly found closure. It was early April, and I had just gotten home from a long day of shopping. I decided to get some dinner and watch videos on my phone for a while. A couple hours passed, and I decided I was bored and asked my parents if I could go on a walk. By this time, it was almost 7:30 p.m., and it was starting to get dark outside. But I thought, why not, since it would be a short walk. I grabbed my phone and headed down the stairs and out the door. I decided I would walk up a hill near my house, certain that I would be back down before it was pitch black outside. This hill had a one-lane road going up it, with close to 4-foot tall grass on the side. Halfway up the hill, I realized I had underestimated how dark it was going to get, because by this time, I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, because after all, a phone flashlight isn't very far ranged. I reached the top of the hill and looked at my phone for a minute. Realizing it was at 20%, I turned to start back down the hill, but as I did, I saw a person walking with a flashlight up the hill. The person started waving the flashlight around in circles. I thought the person might be trying to get my attention, so I waited at the top for them to catch up to me. But as they got closer, I realized the mistake I had made. Now, I am not the type of person to judge, but this person was really scary looking. They had frizzy dark hair, a heavy coat on. Mind you, it was close to 70 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and long baggy pants. But what freaked me out the most was the sound they were making. They made a weird humming sound, but it sounded like they had their tongue on the roof of their mouth. It was a low sound. I was getting really nervous at this point, so I decided I wasn't going to wait for them. I started walking along the road again, hoping I could find another road to walk onto. My plan was to find another road and then sprint home. After they got up the hill and I could see them again, they screamed at me. It wasn't a word though, just gibberish. I started walking faster because at this point, it was totally pitch black outside, besides this person's light, and I could barely see because I turned my phone off to preserve the battery life. Finally, I saw a trail going into a patch of trees. I ran towards it. The person must have seen me start running because they picked up their pace. I was being chased. The trail started going downhill and I could see some dim streetlights at the bottom. The person kept running after me, only to get faster as the trail headed down. After about 5 seconds of running, I hear the person grunt loudly, only to realize they had fallen. Their flashlight rolled down the hill. I didn't care. I just ran until I got back on a road. I eventually made it back home and told my parents what had happened. They scolded me and called me selfish because I didn't see if the person needed my help. But what they failed to realize is, if they really needed help, they would have said something instead of chasing me. Now I refuse to walk alone at night, and I highly recommend that you don't either. You never know who you might meet on a dark road. I am a mail carrier here in California. A big part of my job is delivering Amazon packages, and as you can imagine, my workload has increased significantly during the last year or so. As per usual, this has increased the number of strange encounters I have had. My current route for the past 6 months led me through multiple subdivisions of large, beautiful homes, like swimming pools with hot tubs in every backyard. Given the past year, I have noticed people, mainly older folk, have really taken to coming outside to talk to me across their yards. I don't mind at all, but try to keep it short so I don't fall behind on deliveries. One of my favorite residents is an older lady who I will call Mrs. Lithgow for the sake of this story. She must be well into her 70s and loves to chat about everything going on in the neighborhood. It's not unusual for her to report back that so-and-so has left their lawn unattended for 2 months, or that they have strange visitors at odd hours. I usually just nod and smile. The house across the street from Mrs. Lithgow was only listed for sale for a few days when it was purchased really quickly. Shortly thereafter, my truck began to fill up with Amazon packages for whoever lived there. Mrs. Lithgow noticed right away and told me a week later that the packages would stay in their pile until nighttime and then will have disappeared by morning. This didn't seem strange to me at the time. Mrs. Lithgow became further concerned and began telling me that there always seemed to be a lot of screaming coming from the house later in the evening. I hadn't heard anything, but my deliveries were always earlier in the morning. My first strange encounter was dropping off a stack of packages. I had loaded my arms way higher than I'm supposed to and was waddling up the path. I felt my foot hit something hard and thought I felt it break. I set the stack down and to my horror, realized I had kicked a bag of garbage that had fallen open. Sticking out of the top was a jar with what looked like blood inside. It was leaking onto the hot stone path, and as soon as I had stopped, the smell was unbearable. I also noticed that there was a creepy doll in the bag. I quickly finished my delivery and got out of there. I thought about calling the police, but honestly, I was afraid to, so I talked myself out of it. Mrs. Lithgow approached me a few weeks later, telling me that she had finally met the homeowner. After the whole bottle incident, I was pretty interested to know who lived there. Mrs. Lithgow said it was a petite, pink-haired woman who said she was living there with her autistic charge. Mrs. Lithgow thought it was so strange that this young woman lived there alone with this other person, but no one was ever seen coming or going. I chalked it up to the virus and went on with my day. Mrs. Lithgow, however, did not. The next day, she came racing to the side of the road. I had to remind her to stay 6 feet away, but she was shouting that there had been an incident. Apparently, the woman living in the house and the man she cared for had been spotted outside in the backyard. Kids were playing a few houses down and came running in yelling that the autistic man had threatened to kill them after yelling at them, "Do you know who I am?" I'll admit, I wanted to know more, but didn't have the time to ask questions. Another time, she told me that pink smoke had billowed out of the house and 2 people came running out, screaming. After that, I didn't see Mrs. Lithgow as she had left town to visit one of her kids. The house stayed quiet, and I continued to leave stacks and stacks of packages there. I began to notice that the names on the packages were often different, lots of times just being Fat Goblin, quote-unquote, and other weird things. I once ran into 2 electricians leaving the house. As I passed them, one of them said, "That house is full of cat feces. Full of it." When my route was slightly altered so their address was later in the day, I also started to hear the yelling that I think Mrs. Lithgow had been referring to. It definitely was a grown man, and he was constantly yelling almost incoherent things like, "Me cause crying." At first, I thought he might have been yelling at me, but several times I noticed he was yelling before I even approached the house. I thought maybe it was linked to his diagnosis. Honestly, none of these occurrences were that weird to me, given some of the other experiences I have had. A few weeks ago, I had to deliver a package that required a signature. I had never actually seen anyone there myself, but I knocked anyways. I heard a small shriek and shuffling about. Concerned, I walked toward the side of the house, but still in front, and yelled, hello? I need a signature for a package here." The shuffling continued. I went back to the front door to knock one last time, and to leave a note letting them know where they could pick it up. I suddenly heard loud and fast stomping from inside the house. I peeked into the glass of the door to see if someone was coming. It was a stocky man, dressed in a spandex suit from head to toe. He was holding some kind of weapon and waved it in the air. I stepped back in shock. I froze just for a second, long enough to hear him yell, "You're not safe here." That was enough to get me moving again. I turned and began to run. As I raced down the driveway and back into my truck, I could now fully see the man, holding his weapon, yelling, "I kill." I took off. I called my supervisor immediately, but was told there is nothing we can do about it, because technically, I was on his property and he never directly threatened me. I still think I should have called the police. I began leaving the packages at the end of their driveway, and have not heard or seen anyone in that house again. I live in a rather rural area, the kind of place where you both know what to expect and don't know what to expect. People here tend to be latched onto the older way of thinking and living, and I'm all for that. That being said, it is easy to assume that nothing much happens here. At least, nothing that would really raise any red flags. The thing is, about 5 years ago, something abnormal did happen. 5 years ago, I thought I was going to lose my life due to a case of wrong place, wrong time in the parking lot of an all-you-can-eat buffet. I was in middle school at the time and was having one of the worst school years yet. Luck didn't seem to be on my side, so of course this day wouldn't be any different. My family, grandpa, mom, and little sister, had gone to church that morning and had taken my friend and her younger sister as well. Once it was over, my mom decided that we would treat ourselves to an early lunch and headed over to a local all-you-can-eat buffet. It was a humble place, and the atmosphere of the farm around it was peaceful. It lulled you into a sense of security. We were waiting in the lobby area, sitting on a bench, when 2 women came in. They both seemed to be in their 40s. The taller woman was obviously the leader of the 2, and the shorter woman seemed to hang back, letting the other do the talking, chiming in here and there. The taller woman was gushing over how adorable my sister was to her. She was in elementary school at the time, and kept saying how she looked like a princess. We thought she was just an overly expressive and nice woman, and left it at that as we walked to our table and got settled in. Fast forward, and we are eating dessert. I had gotten my usual, that being a mixed vanilla and chocolate ice cream, topped off with Oreo bits, caramel, and 2 marshmallows covered in chocolate from the chocolate fountain. Yes, I know, I kinda went overboard, but whatever, I was a kid. I was about 3/4 of the way done with my dish when the 2 ladies suddenly appeared at our table. I immediately thought it was odd that they deliberately searched us out in there, but kept eating. The lead woman got to talking about herself and revealed she was a church official. She claimed to work in a sort of crisis center at her church, located in Delaware. Her friend, I cannot remember whether she actually told anything about herself, but if she did, none of us can recall it. They then told my mom and grandpa that they had a gift for my sister, and I admit, I was kind of jealous upon hearing that. Of course, she was getting a gift. The woman pulled some letters out of her purse and showed them to my mom and sister. She told us that she was pen pals of a sort with Princess Kate. I later would learn from my mom that the letters were basically automatic replies, not actual letters from Kate herself. So, nothing special really. It's like the equivalent of getting the answering machine to a secretary in the mall. But nonetheless, my mom went along with it. Then, to my surprise, the woman said she had a gift for me. But unlike the gift from my sister, which had been in her purse, she said mine was in her car. Red flags immediately went up in my head. There was no way I was going with this random lady, alone,
out to her car. My mom, to this day, I have no idea what she was thinking, told her that I could go, so long as my grandpa went with me. My grandpa gave my mom a "what are you talking about? Why should we go with them?" look, and turned to me. I hesitated, but we walked out with the two women. At this point, knowing the head woman was a church official, I figured she was going to give me a Bible or something. My grandpa, in his late 50s, seemed uneasy and stuck close to me. As we approached the car, I saw that it was in fact not a car at all. It was a van. A white van. Cliché, I know, but it's the truth. We followed the two women over, and the leader walked over to the passenger side. We were right behind her, but had failed to notice the other woman lagged behind and placed herself between us and the exit between the van and the other car. The lead woman was in front of us, meaning we were boxed in. No way out. The leader unlocked her doors and pulled open the sliding door, ducking inside. My grandpa seemed to tense up, his eyes darting around. He had noticed the other woman was blocking us off and was on edge. He had a bad feeling about this and was fully prepared to fight these women to save me, if need be. Then, something that I never would have dreamed of happened. The woman, after rummaging around in her van, emerged, wielding a sword, and not some fake prop sword that you get at Party City or something. A legit sword. Glinting in the gray autumn light, its hilt adorned with details and jewels. I just about crapped my pants. I thought this was the end. I was going to die by the blade of some psychotic church official in the parking lot of a rural buffet. My grandpa's eyes went wide, and I saw his hands clenched into fists, and he prepared to knock this woman out. This seemed to go in slow motion, taking forever, but was only a few seconds. And then, as my life flashed before my eyes, this woman asked us what our names were. The sword was still in her hand, but she didn't swing it at us. I was terrified, thinking this woman was the kind of killer who likes to know her victim's name before doing the deed. I told her my name. She then performed a small ceremony, reciting some religious statements, and lowered the blade to touch both of my shoulders, one at a time. She then brought it down to my head and raised it, bringing it in front of herself, straight into the air, and proclaimed me Sir, insert my name, a knight of God. She asked the same of my grandpa, and after getting his name, did the same for him. She told us that she hoped we liked our gifts, and still shell-shocked, we thanked her, and my grandpa and I left the two women. We speed-walked inside, found our table, and proceeded to fill my mom in on what just happened. She didn't believe us at first, but we soon convinced her. My grandpa and I both scolded her for making us go out with these women. My grandpa was especially angry. If that woman had other intentions with that sword, we would both be dead. The women didn't come back over to us, and oddly enough, we didn't see them when leaving. We never saw those women again, and suffice it to say, I'm glad. They weirded me out, and I just hoped they went back to Delaware where they belonged. Maybe they could knight other random strangers along the way. It's been half a decade now since my grandpa and I were proclaimed knights. My close friends sometimes refer to me as Sir, which I find funny. I never let my mom live that down either, prodding her about it whenever I get the chance. All in good fun, of course. It's also a fantastic story to tell people and get them interested in you, and no one I have met has been able to top me when we get to sharing. Now, one last thing has always lingered in the back of my mind, something that still unsettles me to this day. About 2 weeks prior to this event, there had been some beheadings a few states over that had made the news. It makes me wonder, could it have been those two women? Was I knighted by a murderer? I am a 27-year-old man from Dallas, Texas, and as far back as I can remember, I have always had some sort of weird intuition about things, places, etc. My mom even says as a kid I used to sleepwalk. She would tuck me into bed, go through the bathroom to my sister's room. Hers and my bedroom were connected through the bathroom at that time. And she said that when she would get to the stairs, there I would be, just standing there staring at her, very unaware of anything. Other times, she said she would wake up and I would be standing next to her bed, just staring at her. But that's just a little backstory. When I was 24, I'm 27 now, I had just gotten into a relationship with my now ex-boyfriend, who is still my best friend. We had been at my place chilling and hanging out, having a great time, and he had gotten up to use the bathroom while I stayed on the couch, trying to find something else to watch. And while he was in the bathroom, I suddenly started noticing the lights begin to flicker. Now, to any normal person, this is no big deal really, and it wasn't really to me at first either. That is until I began to hear what sounded like my mother's voice calling my name, from what sounded like outside my front door, coming up the stairs. I looked at my phone and saw that it was 12:30 at night and started to panic a little about what she could possibly be coming to tell me so late. So I got off the couch to let her in before she could knock, but when I opened the door, she wasn't there. She wasn't coming up the stairs. I went to the outside balcony and her car wasn't even outside. My boyfriend came out of the bathroom and asked me what I was doing with the door open, and I told him, I thought I heard my mom. He responded, confused, "This late?" We both chuckled and sat back on the couch to watch a movie, but I remember I wasn't feeling comfortable anymore. It was about 2 a.m. when my boyfriend and I decided to call it a night. I walked him out the door, kissed him goodnight, and before he walked down to his car, he turned and looked at me sort of puzzled and said, "Be safe." Now this may not seem weird or eerie, but the thing about it was, I was at my home. We usually would only tell each other when we were leaving the other's house and driving home. And the way he said it, as if he was absolutely terrified that this was the last time that we would see each other. I told him, "I will." Watched him get into his car and drive away. I went back into my apartment and immediately went to my room to go to bed. I laid down and turned on an episode of Golden Girls. I began to feel myself drifting off to sleep and eventually just fell asleep. While I was sleeping, I kept feeling like someone was entering my room. I kept sensing my bedroom door opening and closing, and someone just hovering, watching me. I found myself not being able to wake up and see what was actually going on, but also knowing it wasn't an episode of sleep paralysis, which I have also experienced. The final time I sensed my door opening, a figure popped into my head and was standing in my room. At first I couldn't make it out, but then my mind cleared, and it was Scar from The Lion King. At least the head was Scar. He was wearing a black suit and had human legs and glowing red eyes. He stood in my doorway. He flicked out one of his claws on his paw like you do a switchblade in an old movie. And I remember it being a really loud flick. He licked his lips and said, "Rest now, young one." After that, I just remember being awoken by my phone ringing. It was my mom. I answered groggy and still half asleep to her asking, "Are you okay? Something told me to call and check on you." I sat up and realized it was daylight outside. I looked down at the phone and also saw that it was 12:30 in the afternoon. I rubbed my eyes and said I was fine, just trouble sleeping. I then asked, had she come by my place last night at all? And she said, "I was going to, but I decided to head home instead." "How did you know?" I lied and told her I didn't, just asked. Now call me paranoid or crazy, but as soon as I moved out of that apartment, I had actually forgotten about this whole ordeal until my ex asked me recently, "Do you remember that time your mom came over at like midnight?" It actually sent chills down my spine when the whole night came flooding back to me. Scar has only come back twice since I have moved, and sometimes, randomly, I can still hear the flick of his nail. Lion King nightmares. They are the worst.